Hello and welcome to the Lumina podcast. Today we're going to be chatting about the stories that shaped you. So, welcome to Illumina. I'm so grateful you're here. I'm Julie, a registered therapist. And if you've followed me through the integrative therapist, then thank you for being here and present. Illumina is an evolution of that work, an expansion beyond therapy into a broader exploration of healing, self discovery, embodiment, and the human experience. And honestly, the shift feels deeply aligned with the very conversation we're exploring today. Because Illumina was born from the idea that healing is not about becoming someone entirely new. It's not about fixing yourself into worthiness. It's about remembering, returning, a return to the light within, the part of you that existed before the roles, before the conditioning, before you learned who you thought you had to be. So whether this is your first time listening or you've been here for a while, welcome. The space will continue to hold thoughtful conversations around mental health, emotional well being, nervous system awareness, healing, relationships, embodiment, and personal growth, integrating the mind, the body, and the spirit. But this next chapter invites us even deeper into that human experience itself. Not just how we cope, but how we relate to being alive, how we inhibit ourselves, how we return home internally. And that is exactly where today's conversation begins. A gentle reminder before we do begin. This podcast is for education and self support. It is not a substitute for professional therapy, counseling, or medical advice. Everyone's journey is so unique, so please explore what feels supportive for you. And if you're struggling, reach out to a qualified mental health professional in your area. You do not have to carry things alone. Help is always available. So let's take a moment. Let's arrive together. I invite you to unclench your jaw, just parting your lips slightly, softening your shoulders. Perhaps a nice inhale in, raising the shoulders. Exhale, dropping them back. Take a slow breath in through your nose and a longer exhale out through your mouth. And just notice yourself here, in this space, in this present moment. Not who you need to become later, not the version of you trying to hold everything together, just you as you are right now. Well, I'm hoping you feel a little more grounded and ready to jump into this conversation. Settle in and let's begin. So today marks the beginning of a new series inspired by what I call the inner map. It's an exploration of 12 dimensions of human experience. And if you'd like to explore the map further, I invite you to find additional resources, courses, reflections at illumina.com. That's www.illumina, illumina.com. The inspiration for this series comes from the 12 houses. Maybe you've heard of it. It's a framework traditionally rooted in astrology. And over time, I've come to see them as something more universal. 12 symbolic spaces that invite reflection on different aspects of being human. In this space, we'll explore them through more of a therapeutic, somatic lens, and a lens of personal growth and self-discovery. Not as a tool for prediction, not as a way to label ourselves, but as a map for understanding ourselves more deeply. 12 spaces, 12 invitations, 12 opportunities to better understand who we are and the lives we're living. Each house represents a different landscape of the human experience: identity, belonging, relationships, purpose, healing, rest, and everything in between. Together, we'll move gently through these spaces, one at a time, not to analyze ourselves, not to fix ourselves, not to become something new, but to better understand the person that we already are and how we came to be who we are. Each podcast episode is a simple invitation to pause, to notice, and to reflect, to explore how these 12 themes live not only in our minds, but in our bodies, our nervous systems, our relationships, and our everyday lives. Some reflections may feel validating. Others may bring awareness to patterns that maybe you've never noticed before. There's no timeline here, no finish line, no expectation to change anything before you're ready. It's just an invitation to become curious about yourself. And for those of you who feel called to explore a particular house more deeply, each one will eventually be accompanied by a dedicated course experience offering a deeper journey into that room of the inner landscape through reflection, embodiment, exercises, and guided explorations. But for now, I invite you to simply arrive, to open the door, and see what awaits you there. Today we begin at the beginning. We open the door to the first of the 12 houses, the house of identity, the house of self, representing our presence, our personality, our perception, the place where we begin exploring how we came to know ourselves, how we learn to show up in the world, and what it actually feels like to be us. Because beneath every role, every expectation, every story that we've carried lives one of life's most enduring questions. Who am I beneath everything I've been taught to be? So let's journey back to the beginning. Let's reflect about the identity we inherited. Because before we knew who we were already learning who we needed to be. Before we had language, before we had awareness, before we had choice, we were receiving messages. Messages about what was acceptable, what was safe, what was dangerous, what earned us connection, what earned us approval, and what earned us belonging. And long before we develop a conscious identity, we begin developing an understanding of what helps us belong. Think about that for a moment. Before you knew yourself, you were already learning how to belong. You were watching, listening, absorbing, learning the rules of your environment. And those lessons became part of the foundation upon which identity was built. Many of us spend years trying to discover who we are, while overlooking the influences that help shape us. Identity does not emerge in isolation. It is formed through experiences, relationships, environments, culture, expectations, and the stories that we inherit along the way. If House 1 is about understanding the experience of being you, then part of that journey requires us to look beneath the surface. To understand the structure, we first need to explore the foundation. And for many of us, that exploration begins with family, with our caregivers, and with our early experiences in life. Every family has a story. Some stories are spoken aloud through traditions, values, expectations, and beliefs. Many others are communicated more quietly through what was encouraged, what was discouraged, what was celebrated, what was criticized, what was talked about, and sometimes what was never talked about at all. Long before we had the language to describe ourselves, we were learning what it meant to belong within the systems we were born into. And whether we realize it or not, many of those early experiences continue to influence how we see ourselves, how we relate to others, and how we move through the world today. Psychologists have spent decades studying how these early relationships shape our developing sense of self. One of the most influential frameworks comes from the attachment theory, first developed by John Bowlby and later expanded by Mary Ainsworth. And at its core, attachment theory suggests that our earliest relationships become the blueprint for how we understand connection, safety, ourselves, and the world around us. As children, We aren't asking intellectual questions like, who am I? Instead, we're asking much more fundamental questions such as, am I safe? Am I lovable? Do my needs matter? And can I depend on others when I'm struggling? The answers to those questions aren't usually taught through words. They're learned through experience, through thousands of small interactions with caregivers, family members, and the environments that we grow up in. And over time, the nervous system begins forming expectations about the world, expectations about whether people are available to us, whether emotions are welcome, whether vulnerability feels safe for us, and whether we need to earn love or belonging. And eventually, these experiences can become a part of our identity, not just how we relate to others, but very much how we relate to ourselves. And this is where the attachment styles begin to emerge. Some people develop a secure sense of connection, learning that they are worthy of love and that others can generally be trusted. Others may learn to become highly independent, relying primarily on themselves because connection often felt too unpredictable. Some become hyper aware of relationships, constantly scanning for signs of rejection or disconnection. And some move between longing for connection and protecting themselves from it. These patterns are not flaws, they're adaptations. They're brilliant strategies developed by a nervous system trying to navigate the world with the resources it had at the time. But the challenge is, what once helped us belong can sometimes become the very thing that limits us later in life, which is why understanding our early experiences isn't about blaming our families or rewriting the past. It's about understanding the blueprint. Because when we understand the blueprint, we begin to understand ourselves with a little more compassion. We stop asking, what's wrong with me? And we begin asking, what happened that led me to become who I am? And while many of those early experiences help shape our beliefs about ourselves and the world, they often influence something deeper as well. They shape the way we move through life, the way we respond to stress in our environment, the way we relate to other people, the way we carry ourselves when we feel confident, uncertain, welcomed, or rejected. Because our early experiences don't only live in our memory, they live in our body, in our nervous system. And over time, they become woven into patterns of thinking, feeling, relating, and responding. Which means identity isn't simply a story we tell ourselves. It's something we experience. And that's important because identity is not just cognitive. It's embodied. It lives in our posture, our tone of voice, our facial expression, our breathing patterns, the way that we enter a room, the way we hesitate before speaking, the way we apologize before expressing a need, or maybe the way we shrink ourselves or disconnect from ourselves entirely. The body learns. It learns what feels safe, what feels threatening, when it's okay to speak, when it's safer to stay quiet, when to reach for connection, and when to pull away from it. And over time, these responses can become so familiar that they begin to feel like our personality. But sometimes what we've always called our personality is actually a collection of adaptations, of nervous system strategies developed to help us navigate the environments that we grew up in. The nervous system remembers experiences long after the conscious mind has moved on. And this is where House 1 becomes so important, because this space asks a different question. Not who should I be, but how do I experience being me? Not how do other people see me, but internally, what does it actually feel like to live inside my body and my mind? And for some people, maybe they don't know. And for others, maybe it's simply, well, you know what? It feels exhausting. And I don't mean that dramatically. I mean that quietly. The quiet performance, the quiet monitoring of self, the quiet comparing, the quiet pressure that you're carrying, just trying to simply be enough for the world around you. Sometimes people become so externally focused that they lose connection to their internal experience altogether. They know how to function, but not necessarily how to feel themselves, how to be themselves. So I invite you for one moment, before we move on to the next conversation, I'd like to invite you to just have a moment of awareness, not about who you think you are, not about how others see you, but about how you experience being you. Take a slow breath in and a long exhale out. For a moment, shift your attention away from your thoughts and into your body. Notice your posture. Notice your breathing. Notice the expression resting on your face. Notice whether your body feels open or guarded, relaxed or braced, expanded or contracted. And gently ask yourself, what does it feel like to be me right now in this space? Not what do I think about myself, not what do other people think about me, but what does it feel like to live inside my own body in this moment? Simply notice. Maybe you feel tension. Maybe you feel heaviness. Maybe you feel ease and comfort. Or maybe you feel nothing at all. Whatever is present is okay, because identity is not something we only think about with our thoughts. It's something we experience. And awareness of that experience is often where healing can begin. So as we continue to explore the experience of being ourselves, there's another influence that we can't ignore: the culture surrounding us. Because even if we begin reconnecting with our own thoughts, feelings, and our bodies as we just did, we still live in a world that is constantly telling us who we should be, who we need to be, what success should look like, what happiness should look like, what confidence should look like, what a meaningful life should look like. We live in a world that constantly encourages identity construction, personal branding, achievement, optimization, curated versions of selfhood. Researchers studying social comparison have found that human beings naturally evaluate themselves in relation to the people around them. Think about that for a minute. Human beings naturally evaluate themselves in relation to the people around them. In many ways, this is just simply a part of being human. But the challenge is that we're no longer comparing ourselves to maybe a few friends, our family, a small community. We're exposed to hundreds, sometimes thousands of carefully edited versions of other people's lives every single day. And over time, it becomes easy to lose sight of ourselves within all that noise. It's difficult to feel at home within yourself when you're constantly being shown who you could be, who you should be, or who you might become. Social psychologist Irving Goffman describes social life almost like a stage performance, a place where people naturally adapt different roles depending on the audience and environment they're exposed to. And to some degree, that's completely normal. We all show different parts of ourselves in different settings, myself included. The version of you that maybe shows up with your closest friends might not be the same one that walks into a job interview or shows up at work. The version of you at home may be different from the version of you online. This flexibility is a part of being human. But sometimes people begin wondering, which version of me is actually real? The one at work? The one online? The one with friends? Or the one alone at night, surrounded by nobody? And honestly, maybe all of them contain some sense of truth. Maybe each one reflects a different aspect of who we are. But sometimes a deeper issue isn't which version is real. Sometimes the deeper issue is that we become so accustomed to adapting that we no longer know what it feels like to stop, to stop performing, to stop monitoring, to stop shaping ourselves around the expectations of others, and to stop asking who we should be long enough to notice who we already are. And this is where identity and safety become deeply connected. So before we move on to our next conversation, I'd like you to pause for a moment of reflection. Because after conversations like this, people often ask, how do I know what's really me? And perhaps the answer isn't found by looking harder. Often that can create more confusion. Perhaps it's simply found by noticing, taking a moment, and considering the different roles that you play in your life: the parent, the employee, the helper, the achiever, the friend. So ask yourself, which of those parts of me feel energizing? Which of those parts of me feel exhausting? Which parts feel chosen? Which parts feel expected? Which parts feel expansive? And which parts feel restrictive? And perhaps most importantly, where do I feel most like myself within all those parts and all those versions? Not the most impressive version, not the most productive version, not the version that receives the most approval, but the version that feels most natural, most grounded, most at ease. There is no right answer. This isn't about finding a perfect or permanent identity. It's simply an invitation to notice what parts you might be playing, which ones maybe feel like a stage performance, and which ones feel true to you. Because many of the roles we carry didn't emerge by accident. They emerge in response to our environments, to the relationships, and the experiences that taught us something about what was needed to belong, to be accepted, or to stay safe. When the nervous system perceives rejection, criticism, unpredictability, or emotional inconsistency, it adapts, sometimes becoming hypervigilant, sometimes by people-pleasing, sometimes by disconnecting emotionally, or sometimes by becoming highly self-reliant. Polyvagal theory developed by Stephen Porges suggests that many of these reactions are not conscious choices at all, not choices we consciously make. They're biological attempts to create safety in our environment. The people pleaser may be seeking connection. The perfectionist may be seeking approval. The overachiever seeking security. And the emotionally distant person seeking protection. These patterns, again, are not character flaws. They're intelligent adaptations. They're survival responses that are evidence that something is not wrong with you. They're evidence that your system learned. It learned how to adapt and how to protect you, to live and survive in the environment you were in. Not the environment you chose to be in, the environment you were born into. And over time, something interesting begins to happen. These adaptations we repeatedly use don't just influence our behavior, they begin shaping the way we see ourselves. What starts as a strategy can slowly become an identity. The people pleaser becomes a caring one. The overachiever becomes a successful one. The independent becomes a strong one. And eventually, we stop seeing these patterns as things we do, and we begin experiencing them as who we are. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as a narrative self, the internal story we create to make sense of our lives. Because as human beings, we're natural storytellers. We take our experiences, relationships, successes, disappointments, and wounds, and we weave them into a story that helps us understand who we are. And over time, we begin saying things like, I'm the anxious one, I'm the dependable one, I'm the strong one. I'm too much, or maybe I'm not enough. And the more that these stories are repeated, the more they become familiar. And over time, our stories can become so well worn that we stop questioning them as stories. And the path becomes familiar, comfortable, predictable. And we begin believing that who we've been is who we'll always be. But the brain tells a different story, my friends. Throughout our lives, it remains capable of growth, adaptation, and change. Neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. It is one thing I simply call hope, because it reminds us that we are never confined to the identities that we've inherited, the roles we learned, or the stories we've repeated. We are not who we were, and we are not yet who we will become. Again, we are not who we were, and we are not yet who we will become. The stories we tell ourselves do matter, but they are not the whole story. And perhaps one of the most powerful questions that we can pause and we can ask ourselves is, are the stories I'm carrying still true? Or are they simply familiar to me? Because sometimes healing begins when we become curious about the stories we've mistaken for facts. And if some of those stories were created to help us survive, perhaps we can begin asking a different question. Not how do I get rid of those parts or those versions of me, but do I still need them in the same way I once did? What am I still carrying that I no longer need today? Because sometimes growth involves grieving identities we've outgrown. The strong one, the productive one, the endlessly accommodating one, the one who never asked for help, or the one who held everything together. The truth is, many of these identities were acts of love. The strong one learned to carry what others couldn't. The helper learned to anticipate the needs of those around them. The achiever learned to seek worth through accomplishment. And the independent one learned not to rely on what felt uncertain. These parts deserve understanding, not criticism, because they helped us survive. But survival is not the same as living. And sometimes healing begins when we realize we are allowed to set down what we were never meant to carry forever. Maybe it's less about discovering who you are and more about becoming aware of the stories that shaped you, the identities you inherited, the expectations you absorbed, the roles you learned to play. Not so you can reject them, not so you can judge them, but so you can consciously decide which ones still belong in the house you're building today. Because understanding ourselves isn't about finding fault, it's about finding awareness. It's about developing a more honest relationship with ourselves, one rooted less in performance and more in presence, less in self-judgment and more in self-understanding. Beneath many of the struggles we experience around identity is often a very human longing, a desire to feel real, a desire to feel seen, a desire to belong, and a desire to feel at home within ourselves. And perhaps that journey doesn't begin by becoming someone new. Perhaps it begins by noticing all the ways we've learned to leave ourselves behind and gently finding our way back. So as you move through the week ahead, I'd like to leave you with a question. What remains when I stop trying to be who others need me to be? Not the parts that earn approval, not the parts that keep everyone comfortable, and not the parts that learn to survive, but the parts that feel most like comfort and home, safety, not survival. Healing isn't about adding more to ourselves. It's about uncovering what was there all along. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Thank you for opening the door to House One. And if this conversation resonated with you, consider it an invitation to linger a little longer in this room, to explore the stories, patterns, and experiences that have shaped your sense of self. Through Illumina, you'll find reflection prompts, guided practices, resources, and deeper course experiences designed to help you continue walking through the inner map one room at a time. Because sometimes a single conversation opens a door, And sometimes what's waiting behind the door changes everything. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and stay connected to what feels true to you. And remember, you do not have to become someone else to be worthy of love, belonging, or connection. Perhaps healing isn't about becoming at all. Perhaps it's about remembering who you are beneath the roles, the expectations, and the stories you've carried. And with that remembering comes the invitation at the heart of Illumina, a return to enlightenment, a return to awareness, a return home to yourself. Till next time.